Okay, thanks very much. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gillian Fuss to get us started from the Emergency Planning Secretariat.
Thanks, Dan. And thank you everyone for coming and joining us today. Yeah, it's really exciting. We, as I'll explain today, we've been coming together in an informal way for the past couple of months, and it's yeah, it's just really exciting to hear interest in the conversation and to continue talking about how we can better manage our floodplains. So yeah, really happy to be here today. So we as a group are the Build Back Better Together collaborative. So we are a collaborative, it said in the invites, this is word for word from that. So we're a collaborative group of BC-based organizations and experts with the shared goal of helping BC's flood recovery and management efforts to achieve best possible outcomes. So we offer support from a diverse range of interests, experience, and networks, including Indigenous groups, conservationists, farmers, environmental, legal specialists, researchers, and natural resource professionals. So we are a group of essentially like-minded individuals that have been coming together with a similar concern before the flooding, so ad hoc, but became a lot more action oriented as a result of the November 2021 flooding, and have proceeded then to think about and try and understand how we can better support recovery efforts and better support flood planning. So that started out with Build Back Better Together briefing note that, as I understand, was circulated pretty broadly, but I believe was sent to Public Safety Canada as well as, sorry, I'm forgetting the provincial ministry, but sent to the province as well. And then the coordination of, after that letter was released, we then prepared a session on April 12th to have a much bigger discussion about with two ministers, as well as the province and federal government, and several First Nations, and then the Build Back Better Collaborative as well, to talk more about what does the briefing note mean, present on it, answer any questions, and talk about how do we, I guess, what are the next steps to seeing this sort of actualized. And the number one thing that came out of that session was actually that we need to have another session. So that's the session that's happening on July 14th, is a bigger session to talk about some of the same things, talk about Build Back Better Together and how we can action that, and what does that mean for recovery that we're experiencing, that we're doing right now, but with everyone in the room who needs to be in the room. So local governments, federal government, provincial government, First Nations, and others. And so that then below is just an example of some of the organizations that are involved. So Emergency Planning Secretariat, Watershed Watch, Salmon Society, West Coast Environmental Law, Resilient Waters, just where we belong to. Okay, next slide, Dan. So me personally, I am a program manager for the Emergency Planning Secretariat. So we've been around for a little while, but not too long. We support 31 mainland Coast Salish First Nations with emergency planning and preparedness. So we naturally have been quite busy between the fires and the floods over the last couple of years in the pandemic. But we are trying to trying to sort of balance our time between emergency response with all the disasters that are happening and looking into something that's a lot more forward thinking, and how do we create resilient communities that don't necessarily have the same consequences from each disaster, acknowledging that these disasters will continue to get worse, both more frequent and also worse in terms of their scale. So we saw that November was an example of that. So acknowledging that this disaster will be happening again in 30 years, how can we support our communities in preparing for something like that again? So one of the ways that we wanted to do this is by taking the Sendai framework and applying it to the local region with a mainland Coast Salish lens. And so we're building out an action plan called Helix Kaka. So Helix Kaka means to get ready together in Halkamelam. And we should be done the action plan in the next week or so, actually, and have it distribute out to communities and to a few key partners to look at it. And then hopefully it'll be complete by, I believe, the end of this calendar year. So some big plans for us. And it is really exciting for me, at least. We've been working on this for a while, so being able to unveil this. But one of the reasons we wanted to bring that up is because it ties into one of the core principles of the Sendai framework is working towards resilience. So again, reducing the consequences of each of these disasters each time that they happen. So not necessarily adding in protection, but making sure that we don't experience the same issues from the disaster, even though the disaster might be getting worse. The other thing is that the Sendai framework has an all of society, or speaks about all of society in terms of disaster management and disaster planning. And one of the things they mention about that is that it should be run, or it should be sort of organized, and it should come from the most vulnerable of the population. So as we know, in flooding, mainland Coast Salish communities and First Nations in general experience significant flood risks. Particularly here, I think we did a mapping exercise a couple of years ago, and about 75% of First Nations reserves in this area would be impacted by a 100-year flood. So First Nations are arguably one of the more vulnerable populations in our area. And so their leadership in terms of how do we move together in terms of all becoming more resilient is going to be very, very, very important. And that's a key principle that we talk about when we talk about Build Back Better. Okay, Dan, next slide. So what are the other parts about Build Back Better together is actually operationalizing UNDRIPA and DRIPA. So these are some of the key articles that we've taken from DRIPA that we encourage others to focus on to start as a starting point about how we can see DRIPA realized as we move forward in this work. And I think I'm turning it over to Tamsin now. Thanks. Nope, okay.
No, it'll be Jason Lum. Oh, sorry, Jason. You should be able to unmute now.
Perfect. Thanks for the opportunity. My name is Jason Lum. I'm the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional District and a member of the leadership committee of the Lower Mainland Flood Management Strategy. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I was one of the two local government participants who took was able to take part on the April 12th meeting. And one of the key pieces of information that I shared was that I really was concerned that local government wasn't in the room at the time to have these important conversations. And I really appreciate very shortly after the team reaching out from the Build Back Better Together collaborative and inviting local government voices to the table and acknowledging that it's important that we all get in the room at the same time, especially with local government being the owner, operators, and managers of a good majority of flood infrastructure that exists today. So I just wanted or had the opportunity to share that there is a local regional flood management strategy that has been underway for a number of years right now. It's facilitated by the Fraser Basin Council. And we're working on building a region-wide strategy to reduce flood risk. It's primarily local governments who make up a good majority of the members of the LMFMS. And one of the things that I think we'll all acknowledge is that it's extremely important that we work together to build these broad shared principles by which we build back better together. So appreciate the opportunity of being here. Really appreciate the participation from my local government colleagues. I think it's extremely important to be here to share in preparation for the 14th, and it will be just as important or even more important that you encourage your policymakers to participate on the 14th.
Thanks, Jason. I'll hand it on over to Tamsin.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Tamsin Lyle. I'm an engineer and consultant here in Vancouver, and I've worked in flood management and water for about 25 years from both the sort of the consultant perspective as well as in academia. And over that time, I've come to realize that and sort of explore all of these things, that the way that we are currently doing things is really not working. And I really don't need to tell you this, all this amazing group of 50-odd people who've come to join us today, because whether you've been thinking about this for decades or you're just beginning to think about this now, you know that the way that we're currently doing things doesn't work. And that was very strongly evidenced in November when we saw so many communities really devastated by the flooding events that occurred. So we know that the current system is broken, but we're not really understanding or voicing the reasons why that's happening. And I think if we can dive into the reasons for why this isn't working, we can then work towards doing things differently and doing things better. So if we look at the current model, one of the things that we tend to do is we really focus on trying to separate the water, the bad things from the things that we care about. When what we should be working towards is risk reduction, that is making sure that the things that we care about are less damaged during a flood event. And that doesn't necessarily mean separating people from the water. And by doing that, we're opening up this enormous toolbox of options that we wouldn't otherwise be using. We're also moving towards, in the status quo, just doing things the same way that we've done them before, and just sort of digging in our heels and building back a little bit bigger. We're calling it building back better, but really it's building back bigger. Yes, we can build dikes that are a little bit higher to manage our current systems as well as climate change. We can build our pump stations bigger, but then these systems are really fragile. They're not truly resilient to climate change. What if things are more uncertain than we think they are? What if we're going to have bigger events than we're planning for or engineering for? What if the electricity goes out and knocks out the pump station? What if we have a heat event that dries out the dikes and makes them more fallible and more likely to fail in a flood event? We're really not working towards a system that is resilient to climate change. We're kind of digging in our heels the way we've done before, trying to focus on just sort of nudging at the problem and making small changes when we need to be making big changes. And these same systems that we're digging our heels in on also have huge implications for our environmental systems, for the ecology. We've disconnected our floodplains from the rivers, which means that all of the fish cannot sort of cross over and gain the natural nutrients that they need to. We've also disconnected our communities from the floodplain. So 96% of Canadians who live in a floodplain don't know that they live in a floodplain. That's a huge disconnect, especially when we reflect on the pandemic and the recognition that it's super important that we as humans have that connection to nature. It supports our environment or our mental health. We need that connection, and our current systems are breaking us away from this. We're further not really thinking about the long-term financial implications of the choices that we're making today. We're not thinking about the operational costs of longer and bigger dikes, of bigger pump systems. We're also not thinking about the potential failure. What are the costs of failure moving towards the future? We're really not thinking about all of these things when we're making these choices. We do know, however, that these things aren't working, and there is recognition of that at senior levels of government. So we heard just now a little bit about DRIPA, and we've also got the Sendai framework, which is the international blueprint for disaster risk reduction. So there are things that we've already signed on to as Canadians, as British Columbians, that are not currently in the systems that govern us, that fund the projects, or that sort of create the actions that we actually have on the ground. We're really not doing what we said that we were going to do. So just a quick, next slide, Dan. A quick overview of Sendai. So you've already heard a little bit from Gillian, but the Sendai framework, if you don't know what it is, and some of you may not, is an international framework that was developed over decades, led by the United Nations, the UNDRR, Disaster Risk Reduction Group, and it brought together nations and governments and Indigenous communities and academics from all over the world to come up with a sort of overarching vision of what we should be doing to reduce risk into the future. And as we heard from Gillian, one of the key takeaways of that is that we need to consider an all of society approach. That is that everybody plays a role in risk reduction. We all have some responsibility. And that when we work towards risk reduction, we need to be mindful of the holistic systemic world that we live in. We need to be mindful of the environment. We need to be mindful of our culture. We can't just make decisions that are good for our financial and property. We need to be much more holistic in the way that we work. The Sendai framework has 4 priorities, and we're just going to talk about one today, which is priority 4, which is really about what we do after a crisis, after a disaster, to make sure that we are actually building back better, that we're not building back the same to entrench ourselves in the pathway that we know is ineffective, but that we're taking this opportunity to do things differently so that in the future we can recover better and be more resilient to flood, but also to all other disasters. Next slide, please, Dan. So again, this is really the opportunity, the catalyst to do something differently. Right now, we are facing a scenario where billions of dollars are going to be spent. And if we keep doing the same thing that we've done in the past, there is no guarantee that it's not going to happen again. In fact, there's almost a guarantee that it will happen again, and we'll be here again in 30 years, like Gillian said, or 10 or 20. We know it's not working, but we also are not alone in this. There are people all over the world who are facing these same challenges, some of whom are, behind us or in the same place as us in terms of their evolution around disaster thinking. And there are many people who are ahead of us. There are many ideas that we can be drawing from in terms of how we govern, in terms of how we collaborate together, in terms of how we fund, and in terms of the actions that we take on the ground for disaster risk reduction. And so this is really our opportunity to do things better so that we are safer today and more resilient, and that generations to come are in the same space. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in a minute who are going to take you through some of the great adventures out there in the world of flood management and disaster risk reduction, and some of the ideas that we can draw on to work together better as this group.
Thanks so much, Tamsin, and everyone. So at this point, we can pause for a moment, and please feel free to pop any questions you have into the chat box. If you don't have any burning questions, just on basically about the background to this initiative, the context for how it came to be, why we're having this conversation now, and any questions along those lines. And then we'll get into examples of solutions. Sorry, yes, my video is on.
And Dan, I think no one is able to unmute, so they might have to raise their hand or put it in the chat.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And just to reiterate for anybody that's arrived late, yeah, we'll be pausing a couple times for questions. Also, just acknowledge that Tyrone McNeil has just arrived, Tribal Chief of Stolo Council. Yeah, good question. Tanya from City of Abbotsford is asking who is represented on the call. I think, yeah, if everybody could take that moment to rename themselves in the participants tab to allow us all to see which organizations you're joining from, that would be great. You can open the participants tab, click on more, and there will be an option to rename yourself. Or yes, like Tony's just done, you can also type it into the chat box. I think will be the most efficient way because there are quite a few people from province and bids as well. So either one. I think, yeah, I think with that, because we have a tight time today and there's no burning questions that have come up so far, we'll move on to the examples of solutions and best practices. Feel free to drop your chats, your questions and comments into the chat box as we go. Just to say, we'll be hearing from a few different folks. You saw in the outline slide, we got, I think, 4 presentations to run through right now. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Bob Carey, who is one of the co-founders of the Floodplains by Design program in Washington. And you probably may have heard from him before, but yeah, Bob, very glad to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Dan, and everyone. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here today. My name's Bob Carey. I work for the Nature Conservancy, but as Dan indicated, I was one of the founders of Floodplains by Design. And so really what I want to share today is a little bit of background into Floodplains by Design. It could be a quick snapshot of some of what the project work looks like that's hitting the ground. And a sense of how it's working. So next slide, Dan. So just a quick story first. In January 2009, the Puyallup River crested at over 16,000 feet per second. 26,000 people were evacuated from the city of Orting and surrounding communities. It was the largest evacuation in state history. Schools were flooded, many homes were flooded, businesses were flooded. It was a literal disaster. Next slide. But if you flash forward to 2014, the day before Thanksgiving in the fall of 2014, the Puyallup River again crested over 16,000 feet per second. This time there were no mandatory evacuations. A handful of people voluntarily evacuated, but really, I don't even know that that was necessary. There was basically no flood damages at all this time. And the difference was they implemented what we considered a floodplains by design project. They set 1.5 miles of river dike or levee back to double to quadruple the width of the river. They reconnected the side channel you see in this picture to divert some of the water into the reconnected floodplain and take some of the pressure off the neighboring communities. And by so doing, they actually created what is now the largest spawning salmon spawning channel on the Puyallup River. And there's a couple miles of green space and just dramatically reduced flood risk. So it was a real win-win-win. And what made it possible was the county government worked with the cities, the 2 indigenous tribes in the valley, environmental groups, agricultural groups to build a collaborative multi-benefit project. And we had created this new Floodplains by Design program in the state, which offered money to implement this more collaborative work. Next slide. So, so that project was one of the first of this new approach in Washington, led by, floodplain managers in the state that had realized many of the things that Tamsin just shared with you, that the system, this siloed management system was broken. Flood risks were continuing to increase. The environmental health, the salmon runs were decreasing. Farmland was being lost. And there was just a growing understanding that there was a better way to do things. And that's the term floodplains by design is meant to intuit this more collaborative, holistic, multi-benefit approach. And it's not a flood program. It's not a salmon restoration program. It's not an agricultural program. Rather, it's all those things. And those are all the goals of the program. Although flood management is clearly a huge part of it, that is not the only thing. Next slide. So this is really floodplains by design is another way to say integrated floodplain management. And these are some of the core, not the only ones, but sort of a distillation of the core principles of this work, what it takes to enable this kind of work to unfold. First of all, there's much more collaboration than there is in historic flood management processes. You have to have the agreement of the flood control authorities, the local governments, the indigenous tribes, as we call them in Washington, First Nations in your part of the world, and the agricultural community if you're working in an agricultural setting. Secondly, we put these different goals, as I was just saying, on par with one another. So you don't try to do environmental work or flood work or whatever as secondary things, but you think about the river system and the community goals holistically, and you make sure everyone's goals are being met. Thirdly, this has to be locally driven work. Every river system, the physicality of it, the people and the interests that are impacted are different from place to place. So there's no cookie cutter approaches that always work. Rather, you really need these ground up, collaborative, locally driven solutions. And then fourth, flooding, salmon, other things do not happen at a parcel scale. If we're really going to get ahead of these problems, particularly in light of a changing climate, we need to think at the scale of the natural processes, the threats, and that sort of thing that are represented. Next slide. So just real quick, I'm going to give a couple examples of what some of the project work looks like in Washington. There's dozens of projects unfolding across the state now that are taking this integrated collaborative or Build Back Better Together form to them. So this first is the Cedar River outside of Seattle, Washington. Long history of flooding there. That not only you see the picture on the right, there was not only a number of communities that were repeatedly flooded, but the state highway on the right side of that picture that was inundated. The dikes that were protecting it were undermined on a series of occasions. So there was a lot of costs in addition to the flooding of homes. So that community has been helped into a safer place. They've been moved out of the floodway. But that sort of parcel that's on the right side is part of this much larger reach scale scheme to reconnect the river, reduce flood risk to the communities, but also restore that area for both its salmon and green space values. Next slide. Over on the Dungeness River, they have done, as you see those the two images in the upper left, they have done some similar work where they have set some river levees back to give those floodwaters more room to spread out and slow down and be less destructive, and in so doing create better salmon habitat. But there was the bridge in the bottom part that was wiped out in a flood, and so when they rebuilt it, they used floodplains by design funding to I think the span of that bridge is now 3 or 4 times longer than it was. So again, the water can spread out, dissipate, and it's less destructive. But there's also on the Dungeness, they have some low flow issues. It's a drier place. And so water rights were a big thing. So part of the work there with the same grant funding was to make improvements to the irrigation system so that the farmers have longer term water security to water their crops. Next slide. So the first project that I told the story about in the city of Ording and the Puyallup River was the first of a whole series of work that's unfolding on the Puyallup River, which drains into the Salish Sea down in Tacoma. They currently have a partnership of 24 groups that include the county, cities, tribes, and many others. And they are implementing now several dozen projects. They've sort of built on those early successes, several dozen projects up and down the river, where they're doing some dike and levee setbacks to give the river more room, but they're also protecting farmland, improving other infrastructure, restoring salmon habitat and the like. And so it's a great example of a sort of watershed scale management effort. And then they have this whole accounting system where they're tracking the different goals to make sure all the different interest groups are achieving their goals. Next slide. So just real quick, the program started with 9 pilot projects back in 2013. Next. And as I indicated earlier, it's just really taken off. There are dozens of projects unfolding around the state. We've garnered $215 million from the state legislature to support these projects. And it's just been a game changer. If you talk to the local community organizations, local governments that are part of this work, they will attest to the fact that the scale and impact of the work they're doing has increased dramatically from pre-2013. Next slide. And just some more, we did a survey a few years ago. There's close to 1,000 members that are part of the Floodplains by Design network. We did a poll of a number of them a few years back, and you can see on this slide the diversity of interests. The biggest one being those focused on flood risk reduction, but many other groups. Next slide. And they indicated that, because this funding source became available and because of some of the workshops we've done, they were working in a much more integrated and collaborative way, but that transition was leading to real powerful results, new partnerships, less opposition, more funding, more political support, and they were doing bigger project work. So sort of this is some evidence that this approach is helping communities overcome some of the challenges that Tamsin was talking about. Next slide. But the most important thing is what are the results on the ground, and this is just a graphic trying to represent that. But long and short here is that hundreds of families are at less risk of flooding. Hundreds of acres, thousands of acres of working lands have been improved or protected. Thousands of acres of habitat or floodplain wetland habitat's been reconnected to the river. And along the way, many jobs have been created. So with that, I think I will stop and hand it back to Dan. I'm not sure who's up next. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bob. Yeah, up next is Dave Zhender of Farmland Advantage.
Thanks, Dan. Can you hear me, Dan?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, good. So thank you so much. My name is Dave Zhender. I'm with the program Farmland Advantage. And this is just an example of one of the tools that we're trying to spotlight today. Farmland is a program that works with farmers in a bunch of unique ways. And in this case, it's about offering some tools for mitigation on flood mitigation on farmland. Next slide. And why that's relevant, if you don't already know, this slide shows the extent of the agricultural land reserve in the lower mainland. And obviously it represents a huge portion of the land base. And so farmers are affected by flooding, definitely. And they've often been viewed as a victim of the flooding events, which they are. But we would like to talk about them as a part of the solution in this case. And we're going to talk about a couple of specific tools. I apologize. There's a range of expertise on this call today. So some of this may be redundant and maybe some of it will be brand new to some of you. So next slide, Dan. And so for many of you who know a lot about riparian, the land, the creeks and rivers, you understand the role that it plays and the importance of it in flood mitigation, in its ability to receive flows and mitigate the flood by allowing the river to ebb and flow. The deep-rooted species and deep-rooted plants that are growing on the left-hand side of the screen, where the riparian buffer is considered to be healthy, offer that rebar to the edge of the creeks and rivers, so that if and when, and not just if, but when waters overflow their banks, that it doesn't completely wash out the banks and compound problems further down, as opposed to the right-hand side, which is more of an unhealthy riparian buffer, which then doesn't have that same rebar because the trees are largely missing from that equation, and it doesn't have the benefit of buffering, toxins and things from entering the stream, but then also the added shading and which helps to cool the streams, which is very important. Next slide. So this is a very typical type of stream that we'll see throughout the valley. This would be one of those unhealthy waterways. It's probably one that's disconnected, as many of them are. The streams and the drainage channels have been disconnected or are connected to very poor, unfish-friendly connections to the main river systems. Very common to see this farm close to the edge, with blackberries and or reed canary grass being the primary vegetation, which is a real problem because they're so shallow rooted that when the river flows at any volume or the creek, it can really create some damage along those edges and to the fields and also the lands beyond, rather than just simply allowing the water to come up and flood the agricultural adjacent lands. It becomes part of the larger problem. So this is a typical stream. Next slide. This is an example of some of our work on Coxsalla over on Vancouver Island, where we've worked with a number of partners, and we always work with local stewardship groups. And here in this case are they're planting out that riparian buffer, which has been kind of impacted by some of the cattle or the farming operations along it. So, and that's a big deal because up until now, a lot of these reaches along these private lands, the concern was, well, they're, it's private land, not much can be done. What are you going to do in that situation? And that's where we target those areas, come up with some kind of a contract with the farmers that will allow us to do these works and work with the farmers to help maintain them. And it creates a very win-win situation. It's a fair deal that we strike with the farmer, and it's a great deal for society and the whole ecosystem. Next slide. So this comparison shows the kind of results that we're driving for. You typically have your typical waterway in the upper part of the picture here, which is a bit small and hard to see, but there's a planting alongside there. And the hope is that we would end up with something that looks more like the slide, the picture on the lower half of the slide, where you have those deep binding roots along the way. The stream is being shaded and has started to meander a bit. And this is a drastic improvement over what so many of the waterways are in the Lower Mainland now in such a big area of the agricultural land base. It's a real concern. So this is the type of solution that we're driving for. This is the one tool with the riparian health. Next slide. A second tool that I'm going to talk about has to do with flood-friendly cropping. This was a picture taken from space and highlighted by Chris Hadfield. Many of you have probably seen it, showing the Fraser River during the flooding event and the volume of silt and topsoil, frankly, that got flushed out to the ocean because so many of our soils were naked to the erosion of the overland flows from the flooding system there. So that's a huge problem. It's a tremendous loss to productivity in the future, and there's so many better alternatives. And so we can use the mechanism of Farmland Advantage, which strikes these agreements to incorporate more flood-friendly crops. And I'll just show the next slide. So this is just a comparison of a couple of different varieties of wheat. On the left-hand side, we have perennial wheat that's being developed and has a deep and very extensive root system as compared to the very shallow and non-extensive root system of the typical crops that are grown. So we can work with farmers to put in place cropping that makes sense and anticipates flooding events. And this is what really needs to be done, because we know these lands will flood. We know they're going to receive overland flows, but we have to make this deal a fair deal for the farmer. And we don't have time to go into the details of how Farmland Advantage does that. But we're just trying to put it out there that these tools are available, and we don't just have to ignore the farmland. We cannot buy all the farmland in the Lower Mainland to resolve this problem. So working with farmers is a logical approach, and we're so excited to be able to bring that tool to the table and offer it up in the situation, and we feel it has tremendous potential. So with that, I'll go back to Dan.
Thanks so much, Dave. Over to Matt Osler from City of Surrey.
Great, thanks, Dan. So my name's Matt Osler. I'm a project engineer at the City of Surrey, and similar to what Bob was mentioning about local values being incorporated in flood management, I wanted to give an example of how we've done that in Surrey to give kind of the BC context. So the sketch on the left shows about 20% of Surrey's land base that's below the high tide mark. And with sea level rise and the forecast of 1 meter of sea level rise to occur for our community, that in some places increases the risk of an extreme flood by 100 times with 1 meter of sea level rise. So significant challenge for us. And back in 2016, we undertook a participatory process, engaging our stakeholders to incorporate different values ranging from environment to economic to life safety. and came up with really broad landscape level possible interventions. And the thick black line shows the selected long-term strategic direction to basically really shore up one alignment to protect the remaining land better in the face of increasing flood risk. And a lot of everyone from local government probably realizes a lot of their resources go into asset management and maintaining existing infrastructure. So the challenge we faced was, what do we do about a really old piece of infrastructure that was overdue for replacement? And in the absence of a long-term plan, we would do like what Tamsin was suggesting of building back bigger. But having had the opportunity to do a long-term plan that considered all the stakeholder values, we recognized that building the dam in a new location and building it in a way that would be more adaptable to climate change was a better long-term solution. And so that's what we're setting out to do now, to relocate this dam and to build it in a way that's more adaptable. And I'll go into a little bit more detail later about how that's working from a cost sharing perspective. But I just want to emphasize that, again, without this long-term strategy, we'd be really locked into maintaining the status quo of just replacing existing infrastructure. And it would be very difficult to respond to that change of 100 times greater likelihood of extreme flooding under climate change. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a little bit more detail of the coastal floodplain along the Nickel and Serpentine River. And one thing I wanted to highlight, by doing such a participatory process, really big ideas were possible that we wouldn't have otherwise had on the table. So in 2016, I never would have thought we'd be discussing managed retreat for such a large area of the community. And although it wasn't what we selected for this area, it really opened up the space to come up with the solution that I shared on the previous slide. And so the process really does matter because it changes the types of solutions that are being looked at, and it allows us to evaluate solutions long-term for a wide range of values. I do want to acknowledge that these types of processes do take a lot of resources and time, and Surrey being one of the largest municipalities, even for us, we relied on a $500,000 federal grant to do this planning process. But notwithstanding the challenges of planning, I wanted to highlight some of the challenges of implementing these works due to the costs. So on the next slide, please. I've got a little example that shows a suite of projects that we're currently implementing through the Federal Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund. And this program has brought a lot of challenges and opportunities to our community. So from the opportunities side, the federal sort of criteria that is used to select recipients has a lot of wide ranging criteria. So things like innovation, green infrastructure, partnerships with First Nations, all are awarded points for applicants. And so that really challenged us to think out of the box and really come up with the best possible application to have the best chance of being successful in the grant. But on the challenges side, it is a heavily oversubscribed program, and it only provides a minority of the funding. So in our case, it funded about 41% of our program. And this pie graph on the bottom shows that we had to draw on a lot of different partnerships to cost share to implement our projects. And so the city itself had to come up with about 1/3 of the budget. And to really line up all these different partnerships took a lot of time, and it was quite difficult to try to make these investments proactively. And that really governed a lot of our selection of what specific projects could go in, was based on what cost sharing partnerships were feasible. So what's exciting to me here is this idea of building back together. We have some high-level budget commitments from the federal and provincial government that puts us in a really unique position to be proactive in identifying projects to move forwards with. So I just wanted to highlight that, and now I'll pass it on to Kees Lokman to share some international examples.
Thank you, Matt. So yeah, my name is Kees Lokman. I'm the director of the UBC Coastal Adaptation Lab, and currently leading a research project entitled Living with Water, which is funded by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. In the next few slides, I'll briefly talk about this exciting project in Christchurch, New Zealand, entitled the Otakaro Avon River Corridor, and which is an 11-kilometer long blue-green ribbon that regenerates a floodplain for human and more than human communities, and it's here pictured below. So next slide. The plan was developed in response to the earthquake sequence that happened in the area in 2010 and 11. And as a result of the flooding and the earthquake, much of the land was so badly damaged that it was unlikely that residential properties could be rebuilt on it for a long time, or if ever. So subsequently, the Crown set up a funding program to support the buyout of almost 5,500 properties in areas where rebuilding was not safe or financially viable. The next slide. Led by the Maori people and informed by over 5,000 ideas from the public and partners, a vision was developed, and I think this is what Matt mentioned as well, kind of a vision for the entire area. And some of the goals of this vision were to establish a world-leading living laboratory to learn, experiment, and research new ideas of living with water, to demonstrate how to adapt the river's floodplain to challenges and opportunities presented by climate change and flood hazards, to create opportunities for sustainable economic activities, provide opportunities for recreation, leisure, and enhanced well-being, and create restored habitat and water quality. Next slide. And I think what is really important to, I think what we're doing in this group, and I think what we want to talk about further, is that it very much is a place-based plan, and it advances reconciliation, and it foregrounds local Indigenous knowledge in the way that decisions are being made. So I really love this drawing here. It might be hard for you to read, but reflected in the design for the different sections along the corridor, it incorporates different types of vegetation that provides food security, medicinal uses, and also support culturally important species, as well as enhances access to the river and also advances water transportation. And the result is also a 30 to 50 year plan. So not all of it is implemented immediately, but it's really the idea to have a framework in place that allows with the future coming for this implementation of this project to reconnect the communities to the floodplain, create multi-benefits, and all the while reducing future flood risk. So with that, I'll pass it on to Deb, who will talk a little bit about our initial ideas about what principles for building back better together might look like.
Yeah, thanks, Kees. That's great. Just before we get to Deb's principles, or I mean the draft principles we're about to share, just give a quick opportunity to type some questions into the chat if you have any about the examples of solutions that have been presented. But given that we're running low on time, maybe we'll just allow folks to type those in, and I'll hand it over to Deb. So yeah, feel free to keep those questions rolling in. And Deb, I'll hand it over to you. Deb, are you here?
Dan, I think you need to make her co-host.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Of course. There we go. Bingo.
Nice. Thanks, Dan. And thanks everyone for the great presentations and introductions. So maybe we can just go to, yes, thanks, the next slide. So, so I guess here we are then. We have had the experience of November, which I guess in some ways you could think of as our kind of generational event, a collective wake-up call from Mother Nature that what we're doing doesn't set us up well for the future. We're not resilient. We're not ready for climate change. But we have an opportunity now to go forward in a better way. And all of us in this collaborative have been involved in flood related work for a number of years. And we've like everyone have listened a lot and tried to understand like what's wrong, why are we here. And it seems to us that there actually are excuse me, a lot of things that we agree on, that we could do. We could take advantage of these great solutions that you've heard about, but we're kind of stuck in our system and our status quo way of doing things. So it seemed valuable to us to just think about like what are the principles or the pillars or the buckets of shared things that we can agree on that can ground us going forward. And we thought it would be really valuable for folks to come together, and that's what we're hoping to see on July 14th, for leadership to come together and essentially affirm what everybody wants to see in this region. And so we're calling this Build Back Better Together, working together, building this foundation of shared principles so that we can be more resilient and recover better in our shared landscape. And as you've heard, both the federal and provincial governments have endorsed the Sendai framework. It also, as you've heard, aligns well with the First Nations emergency management planning that's underway. It's an approach that makes sense. It's being used around the world. And one of the grounding principles of that is understanding risk well, and then reducing it and doing so in a way that helps you be prepared for a changing climate. So that's kind of the center of this attempt at a kind of schematic to think about this approach, this shared approach going forward, that hopefully we can agree on that as one of the principles going forward. Secondly, it is we are in a time of reconciliation. We have reconciliation work. It's work for Indigenous folks and it's work for non-Indigenous folks. It's work we're going to do together. And so this is a really important aspect of flood recovery and resilience going forward. Historically, flood management and infrastructure has been built in a way that has not protected First Nations communities. First Nations communities haven't been involved in decision making. They haven't been, part of the planning. They haven't had the capacity. This is important work that needs to happen to go forward, and it's good. It'll be good for everyone. And that's linked to this idea that everyone is part of the solution. I think it was Bob that was talking about how in the floodplains by design work, it's really important to make it place-based and to get everyone involved in looking at what makes sense for a region. Neighbors need to work together. Dave's also spoken about farmers, and farmers can also be part of the solution. The Lower Fraser, as we know, in the Fraser River itself, is one of the greatest salmon rivers in the world. It doesn't make sense to think about flood recovery and resilience going forward without thinking about the salmon and the ecosystems that they're part of. Let's not make that something that we do things and then afterwards we reflect, oh, was that good for the salmon or not good for the salmon? Let's do it. Let's bring this work all together. And certainly, you know, we have lots of ideas now about fish-friendly infrastructure, about reconnecting floodplains, and natural defenses. Nature-based approaches have been shown to work and be more cost-effective in many ways, and provide more resilience over the longer term. But let's ground ourselves in those approaches. It doesn't mean we're going to say, you know, 100% green infrastructure, but we need to have a mix of solutions, gray and green, going forward. And then finally, coming around the circle and bringing it all together, of course, we need to protect our economies, our livelihoods, and our communities. It's not good when Highway 1 is underwater. These are problems that, you know, we need to work on together. It doesn't make sense to have local governments bearing the sole burden of managing these recovery issues in the region. So these are what we're hoping, sort of the I guess the areas that we're hoping to have dialogue about on July 14th. Next slide, please. Something that we can look at in the short term, because, you know, this is a flood recovery and ongoing resilience is something that, you know, will project far into the future, and of course will benefit future generations. But we need to have a long-term lens, as Matt has said, because it opens up the solution space for us. But in the short term, we can think about funding, because funding is really driving decision making at the moment. And we have large funding opportunities on the table, probably unprecedented amounts of funding associated with the recovery from the November events. Let's look at, you know, investing that money and future funds in ways that don't just lock us into the status quo, because we'll be facing the same problems again. If we have thoughtful funding programs, we can produce these multiple benefits. And Bob has given us some examples of how that works in floodplains by design, and how critical funding is for that. So we're suggesting that this really is an opportunity to think about implementing these principles as they could emerge from dialogue through funding criteria and prioritization of projects. There are good projects out there right now that simply can't get funded in the existing system. Next slide. Thank you. So just to sum up, we see a lot of benefits in this approach of building back better together for our region. We think it's a way going forward to minimize risks, to protect critical infrastructure that we all depend on. It's a way to do the climate justice and reconciliation work that needs to be done, to address some of the historical inequities that exist, and also to take steps to protect salmon and other parts of the ecosystem that we also all depend on. It's a way to think about having shared understanding and building relationships so that we can work together effectively as a region. It's a way to support livelihoods and community, recreation, natural beauty, and also, again, just to think about reconnecting the floodplain so that salmon and other species can thrive here as well for the long term. And that's it for me. I think it's over to Erica to describe in a little bit more detail how we picture July 14th going, and the dialogue that we're hoping to support on that day. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. And thank you so much for giving that great overview of what it is that we're using as the basis, the jumping off point for the July 14th forum. So you are all here, you would have received the invitation to this forum. So this has been sent out to leadership across all levels of government. So First Nations and local governments, local and regional governments across the Lower Fraser area and Mainland Coast Salish, as well as a range of folks from provincial and federal government who have been invited and will be there for the conversation as well. And the idea here is to bring together leadership from all of these levels so that together we can come to these questions and really explore that common ground that you've been hearing about today, those principles or pillars that Deb just outlined, and really look at, can we find common ground enough to discern some directions that we can go and ways that we can start to work towards building back better together, so that we can enhance our resilience and we're better prepared for what's coming going forward. It'll take place in Abbotsford at the Clarion Hotel. And next slide. And the way that we're approaching this is really in the manner that you've been hearing about today. So we know that to do this and to do things well benefits from bringing together a wide range of voices and working in a participatory, collaborative way to so that everyone can be part of the solution. And so on this day, we will be spending a lot of time in discussion, in small group discussion oriented around these different topics, and looking at what this would mean in the region for our communities, and what are some steps that we could start to take going forward, the leverage points, the places where we could start to make some change that would make a bigger difference for us as a region. So in the morning, we'll be really focusing on some discussion around those principles or pillars that Deb just outlined, taking those as a jumping off place, also looking for the people in the room to add to that, enhance it, and build that, so that we can come to a sense of something collective that we share, that shared vision, that shared understanding, and have a sense of something that we're all moving towards together. And then in the afternoon, we'll really focus on what some of those leverage points might be for taking those pieces forward. So I think that's about it for the content of today. And Dan, I'll hand it back over to you and see if people have questions. We do have time to explore some of your questions now for some of the speakers, or if you have any questions about the forum itself.
Yeah, for sure. And Erica, we can kind of stick handle this together, I think. We've got some questions for you on here. And then, so you're welcome to, I mean, I don't know what the best way to do this is. I just see a question from Rob about whether the July 14th forum will include the ENGO sector and not just local government First Nations. Yes, that is a good question. At the moment, it is not including local NGOs at this point, except for a few exceptions, I would say.
Yes. So the way that this is being held is that the folks that are going to be in person are leadership from the different levels of government, and there is also an opportunity to participate in as an observer online. So that is one way, if you have an interest, to let us know, and we can arrange for additional people to be included as observers at this point.
Yep, and you'll see in the Eventbrite that there's an option to register online, 2 different types of registration. Erica, without anything else coming in the chat box, I wonder how should we go about the list of questions that we've prepared here?
Yeah, perhaps just an invitation to folks. So as we mentioned, on the 14th, we're going to be getting into more conversation and hearing more about how these principles align and how they land with the things that you're dealing with in your communities and where that common ground might be. So curious to hear back from folks, and maybe Dan, we can put the slide back up, that Deb's slide with the principles. Be great if anyone has thoughts on those principles and which most strongly align with you, with the directions that your community is hoping to go, with the kinds of things that you're seeing in the wake of the flood events in November, and what would you like to see moving forward? So I think what you'll need to do is raise your hand, and then we can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question here, or just share your thoughts on how these are landing for you.
If you're looking for the raise hand feature, it's under the reactions tab. Tanya.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
I just guess I wanted to just say that I really like the idea of having solutions where all of the different aspects are treated the same. I really like that out of the floodplain by design presentation, that, yeah, you're just not really looking at it as just an engineering solution or just a fish habitat solution, but instead it's looking at all of those things with equal value.
Thanks, Tanya.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from others as well, and from your perspective, how is this aligning with the kinds of things that you're juggling as you're looking at recovery, or as you're looking ahead to how to become more resilient to future events? Another thing we'll be exploring on the 14th is some of the both the leverage points, but also where some of the challenges arise in moving some of these things forward. And so welcome your thoughts as well as you think about these directions and what it would take to get there. Some of the concerns or questions that you might be holding about that. Jason, I see your hand up.
I just maybe for some of the folks on the call, there was a Sendai framework. The Sendai framework was brought up a number of times in the presentations, and it was mentioned that both the province and the federal government have made commitments towards signing on to the Sendai framework or incorporating Sendai framework into their legislation. And I'm just wondering if there's a good understanding from in particular, some of the local government representatives, what those implications are going to be for local government. And maybe because I'm not hearing too much back, it's already clearly understood exactly what those expectations are going to be from both the province and the federal government in terms of, I know the legislation is being redrafted in terms of the Emergency Program Act. And I'm wondering what, if all of our local government reps are completely understand what that means, and in particular, do their electeds understand what that means and what the potential changes that we could see coming forward are going to be. And then the only other thing was a lot of the solutions that were presented today involved purchasing land, what I'm assuming is private fee simple land, and either land that was too damaged to rebuild on, or I'm assuming land that was, subject to repeated flooding. And I know that I believe that currently none of the DFAA programs allow purchase of land in some of the in their money for eligibility. So I'm not certain that we would have the ability to actually undertake any of some of these solutions in today's current legislative environment. So I think that's something to keep in the back of our minds. I could be totally wrong, but from what I understand, I don't believe we are. I know there's people from EMBC on the line, so they would know this much better than I.
Thanks for raising those issues, Jason. And yeah, welcome anyone from EMBC or elsewhere in provincial and federal government if there's anything you'd like to speak to there. That will also be one of the great things about having everyone in the room on the 14th, so that we can spark some of these conversations and talk about it from various perspectives together to see what might be possible. Dave, I see you with your hand up. Welcome to jump in.
Sure, I just wanted to add to Jason, though, that that is one thing that's a little bit different about the Farmland Advantage tool, is that it's not about purchasing the land. It's some alternatives to purchasing and leaving the farmers where possible in place and working with them directly and in a contract to that approach, which open up doors that might not otherwise be open because of those constraints. Just thought I'd mention that. I see some more comments in the chat there that might be worth talking about.
Nice comment from, I think a few resources were shared. Yeah, feel free to talk about them. Yeah, James. Oh, we can't hear your audio, James.
There you go, trying again.
There we go. Yeah.
James Casey, Birds Canada. Thank Dan. A great set of talks. I just put in a link to a really interesting paper I quite enjoy, looking at development trajectories for deltas. And when we were talking about challenges that we're going to have to face, one of the clear development trajectories for the delta that we're looking at is thinking about ecosystem services or benefits as things that we can import from other regions through our trade networks, as opposed to maintaining and sustaining them on the delta. And there's various reasons to take either approach, but I think that trade related element is a conversation we're going to have.
Seeing some nodding heads. Yes, thanks, James, for raising that. Wonderful. Also seeing a comment here from Chief Andrew Victor, and just opening the invitation if you'd like to speak more to what you're sharing here about a regional approach, including Indigenous interests and way of life in a path forward. I'd love to hear directly from you if there's anything you'd like to add. Oh, okay, well, we'll circle back and see if we can catch you a little bit later. In the meantime, we've got a few minutes left here, and Dan, I think you've got a poll here we were hoping to share with folks.
Yeah, just a quick kind of question that will bring us back to these principles that we've shared. It's an invitation to select what, oh, and I should have said what 2 principles. So choose 2 of the principles that align most closely for you. Sorry, I didn't include that 2. The number 2. Why 2? I don't know. Just making you choose. Okay, I think most have come in. Oh, no, there's still some rolling in, so I'll just keep waiting while the rest have selected. Okay, I think that was the last rush. Here we go. Without further ado, there you can see the results. It's a pretty even split. Actually, maybe more surprising than you'd think, given you're only able to select 2. So that's maybe a good sign of principles. I think another question that we had was around what principles do you feel like are missing? And you can type these in the chat or unmute and, or I guess raise your hand and speak it. Yes, Bob, taking all the principles, choosing 5. I think if there aren't any,
I don't know if Tyrone wanted to say anything. The closure, perhaps.
yeah, if we're feeling ready to close up the session, I think if there's any last words or not last words, but final questions before we hand it over to close for the day. Yeah, Bob.
Well, I would just add on to my comment that all those principles are important by noting, and I think this is really important, that they're interrelated, right? If you want to care about salmon and flood risk and, you know, economic well-being and the like, you need to involve the different people that understand those issues and have long histories, in some cases millennia, working on those issues and being in relation to those things. You know, you're not going to get there unless you're thinking about all those things in an integrated way.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think unless there's any other burning comments or questions, give another 10 seconds. Oh, sorry, there's one from Francis Wu in the chat box. Yeah, this one, great question. I'll maybe read it out. So how will this collaborative intend to coordinate and connect with ongoing or emerging multi-jurisdictional initiatives, including the LMFMS? I guess this is yeah, I'm curious about who best to answer this from our team. I think, Tyrone, would you be comfortable speaking to this?
Yep, no problem. First of all, thank you everyone for your time. Apologies for being late. I had a report to our most senior First Nations leadership on another hat I wear, so came in a little bit late. With regards to, let me, rather than respond to Francis' question specifically, let me respond this way. Our group got together shortly after the November rain event with the initial intent to guide the distribution of the $5.1 billion committed to respond to the rain event by the federal government in a way that modified funding instruments to better meet our needs. And you heard a lot of that coming out today in terms of Build Back Better and the funding required to respond better. And so when we started having these conversations, taking a look at Sendai, and Sendai is really simple for me, folks. It forces us to take a look at risk differently, particularly under a climate change scenario. So we as Mainland Coast Salish are looking at it as this weird anomaly called the atmospheric river becoming something common every 5 years, 10 years or something like that. How do we respond to that? The 1 in 200-year flood happening every 50 years, 1 in 500-year flood happening every 100 or 150 years. So understanding the risk with regards to climate change and adapting to it in the most resilient fashion. Knowing that even the $5.1 billion isn't enough. We know that none of us here, whether you're a local government, a First Nation, provincial or federal government, can just start building a plan from scratch. You know, the world's not built that way. We need to respond to climate adaptation by taking a look at what our current state is and having a really deep understanding what building back better is per Sendai. In our case here, Build Back Better Together, because we need a regional response to be the most resilient here. No one local government, no one First Nation has a solution or can do it by themselves. But if we come together as 31 mainland coast Salish, 33 local governments on a common plan, that does speak to resilience, that aligns with our values around salmon. And when I say salmon, it's fish, it's migratory birds, it's all that biodiversity within the wetlands and riparian areas caused by opening old waterways to the main stem in such a way that when we hit the freshet, it finds its ways into those old waterways, good for salmon, good for fish. And then when the water's down, it just makes its way back out again. So the criticalness there for me, that alignment is we have the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, which again I've shared with some of you, or some of you might have heard me telling the province and the premier that they have to give you folks as local governments authority to respond to DRIPA. And simply, again, breaking it down, look at Article 29, where we have the right to be involved in protecting our land and resources. But in some cases here, our land and resources are your land and your resources. So there's a layering there that we need to come to grips with. And we're looking for willing partners is really what we're looking for. Hoping that many of you are like-minded with us on wanting to be more resilient, wanting to think 100 years into the future, wanting to look at a broad richness of biodiversity for all the right reasons, knowing that this is going to be new. The province doesn't have a comprehensive Build Back Better policy framework or funding methodology around it. So this is our opportunity to instruct and give direction, collaborating between local governments and us as First Nations, on telling BC and telling the feds what policy do we need here for our portion of the world here. Now bridging it into France's question around, we're going to do the best we can here in the lower reaches of the Fraser from Yale down and Squamish on their side there. But we can better manage risk and better adapt to climate change by looking at a watershed-wide perspective. And that's where the BC flood strategy comes in. And I'm actually co-presenting that strategy with the province tomorrow at a BC First Nations, all BC First Nations session on emergency management. So there's an opportunity to reach outside of our area here into other areas such as forestry, such as water management and other policy areas, mostly driven by the province, that limits or potentially limits the amount of risk and level of risk that we have here in the Lower Fraser. So this call today is intended just to give you a primer of what it is that we're going to be demonstrating your leadership. And I see the comment around NGOs. I get it, but we need to win over local governments and the rest of our 31 mainland coast Salish communities to be aligned politically for any of this to happen. And this is the first of a series of meetings that has to take place. It's really about us taking control of our own destiny with willing, like-minded partners between our communities and use local governments. And there are friendlies within provincial and federal agencies as well, but they need our collective political will to shove them into alignment or into a better position where they can support us going forward. So I hope this makes sense for you. I know that implementing Sendai and implementing DRIPA is a new world for local governments, but I'm confident we can find our way there together, that we can learn and support each other along the way. We've all got a vested interest in the land, whether it's agricultural, whether it's industrial, whether it's residential, whether it's natural landscape. We have a vested interest. So really hoping that you will inform your elected leadership to the good reasons why we want to do this, the values, the principles going forward. We're here for the long term, and we want to be a part of the solution that plans for the long term in that resilient fashion that aligns with our worldview, and looking for willing partners again. I think I'll leave it there for now, Dan. And just again, thanks. We've taken a lot of people's time today, but we really appreciate that and grateful for your time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tyrone. I wonder if it would make sense for Jason to also give a quick answer on that. Yeah, Jason, to give your perspective.
Sure, and I I really appreciate Tyrone, your words and some of your perspective on this. And what I see this, and maybe addressing some of Francis's comments are, there are initiatives. There are always going to be a lot of other initiatives that are underway, and I don't see this as a threat to any of those. I see this as an opportunity for us to try and build some a real high level consensus around some of these guiding principles by which we prioritize the work that's going to be. It's not to slow down, stop, or ignore the fact that there are some good initiatives that are underway. And there's going to be initiatives that are going to be probably more successful speaking to specific constituencies because of the relationships and the networks they have access to naturally. But I also think that for us to also have the opportunity to be in the room together and to listen and to find out where some of the common ground is. And there's always going to be places where we maybe disagree and we and won't move forward on, but I think there's going to be a heck of a lot more that we do agree on. And I think one of those things right off the bat is to help build capacity for First Nations to be at the table in a real meaningful way. And I think, that's something that it was easy for me to agree right away here that, I know that there's good work being done by EPS with the Coast Salish communities, and there's also equally good work being done with the local governments and some private industry groups. And I think, and with NGOs as well. So there's a lot of work that's happening, and I see this as more as an opportunity for us to get in the room and begin, talking about what these guiding high-level kind of principles that we can agree on together, and what that means when we start building for the future and for future generations.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jason and Tyrone, for helping us close this session up. I think without further ado, I think that's the end of our today. And so thanks for all of our members of the Building Back Better Together Collaborative, and also for all of you taking the time to be with us today.